So let's open it for questions. Ken, are you still on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. As people are walking to the John, go ahead.
Yeah, a question for Chris. When you highlighted the underlying root causes for growing complexity, you didn't mention a potential contribution from multiple reviews of the protocol, either internally within an organization or externally. We found that as the number of reviewers grows, and we didn't do really any hard and fast analysis of this, but there seems to be more procedures, bells and whistles added to the protocol, and then you compound that with an external review that may add their own, elements to the protocol that increases the complexity. I wonder whether you or whether Ken Getz maybe has data on that, and is there a potential solution to limit the number of reviewers to a fewer number of quality reviews, and what would be the trade-offs of that in terms of robustness of the protocol?
Okay, I'll start. I have no specific data on that, but it makes good sense, and I would share your sense that that's likely the case, and in fact, I think it's a big issue for NIH trials as well. The number of kind of the committee structure, the number of sub-studies and reviews does add substantially to the complexity of NIH trials as well. But Ken, maybe you have specific data on this.
We don't have data on this. We do see a number of companies that have constituted independent committees, some of them with positioning that they're capable of actually challenging the design of a study, but they don't really have a lot of leverage in the organization at this time. There's a very high sense of risk at simplifying protocols and failing to gather data that may be requested by the agency or that may be useful in the future. And so we just don't see them having much of an impact at this point.
Penny Moore from CMTP. This is a question directed for Ken Getz. I was wondering about the 25% of non-core items that are collected. What have you looked at whether the percentage of those that might be collected for post-regulatory decision makers, and whether or not you think that there might even be some efficiencies by collecting those data for registration trials as opposed to doing 2 trials, and I just wanted you to comment on that.
Yeah, I like your thinking, and that's exactly what a lot of companies are beginning to do. They're trying to sort of dig into more granularity in understanding what constitutes a non-core procedure, and really asking the hard question, is this a procedure that we want to keep in this particular study at this time, or is it something that could be delayed or even removed? When we first published the results of the study, we got a number of phone calls from people who wanted to know what specific procedures are non-core. And that really defeats the purpose of the study. There's no clear answer to that. It depends on what are the primary and key secondary endpoints and what are the objectives of the study. And so as a result, the real key is to go through that kind of scrutiny that you're describing and understanding that there's a trade-off. For every procedure that we add, although its marginal cost may be small relative to the total budget of the study, when you aggregate all of the costs of these non-core procedures, it adds much more complexity, which has huge time expansion. It creates more inefficiency and lowers the quality of the trial. So there are huge cost elements here that should be part of our decision to choose whether to keep or remove or delay a procedure.
Michael McGinnis, Institute of Medicine. I just have a holding question. It's a bridge question for the next panel, so I'm going to defer, but I knew the line was going to be long, so I thought I should reserve the right of last point.
Right, Mike?
Mike Lauer, NIH. I'm wondering whether any of you have data on whether or not the trends that Ken is seeing in industry-funded trials is also true for government-funded trials.
I'm so glad you asked that question. We're actually now in the process of trying to conduct a similar effort. A number of NIH staff have come to us and said that they believe anecdotally that what we're observing in industry-funded research is occurring among government-sponsored programs as well, but we don't have any hard data to support that at this point.
Can Can I
And
just
if I can just
add that,
ask a question,
sorry, in clinicaltrials.gov,
Yeah.
the number of outcome measures per trial is approximately the same in NIH funded versus in industry. So for that one metric, we don't see a difference.
and you kind of maybe just ask an add-on question to that. Do you think that the common feature between an NIH study and the industry is the principal investigator? Do you see more force from the principal investigators, adding on more fields to pad their publications?
Yes, we have found, in fact, when we've tried to understand some of the drivers of complexity, that often it's the principal investigator or the co-investigator that can be a critical contributor to adding additional procedures. Sometimes it's really for a very personal interest that, in a sense that we can piggyback some of our procedures on an existing protocol. So that it's very much driven by sort of the scientific objectives and scientific interests of the investigator.
I just said to Chris, I think we're all guilty of that. So.
Yeah, Jose Vega, Amgen Global Safety. So clearly, in terms of the safety data, that collection of safety data, Dr. Horwitz mentioned that yesterday, as we mentioned today, there's some inevitable minimum set of data we need to understand the safety profile, particularly of a new molecular entity. So whether it's late in development, phase 2, 3, or even in the next several years post-approval, where we're still doing additional trials, there is the need to still understand the safety profile, and there's always new insights and new safety signals that are discovered during that phase. So in my case, for example, as head of the safety group, I do have frequent discussions and conversations with our clinical development colleagues. I was one of them for many years, who are trying to make trials more cost-effective, decrease the number of case report forms, et cetera. But we cannot compromise on getting the necessary information. This is the one opportunity we have in clinical trials to get the kind of data, the detailed data we need to understand whether a safety signal, an imbalance, for example, is potentially a true risk for the molecule that needs to be communicated or even mitigated. So in that sense, I don't know if the safety procedures or safety elements were part of what were classified as non-core information, but hopefully not. Because I think we do have an obligation, even if it wasn't required by regulators. I think as industry developing new treatments, we have an obligation to understand the safety profile in order to ultimately assess the benefit risk. It is true that regulators will ultimately ask a lot of these questions anyway, so we do need that data, but we need to generate it anyway ourselves to understand ourselves the benefit risk.
Yeah, I think that there are kind of two lines of conversation here. One is that, are all studies eligible for LSTs? And the answer is no, they aren't, obviously. So a brand new first-time NME is likely not going to be a candidate for an LST. The other part is there still extraneous fields that we can reduce even in those, really novel approaches that need parallel pathophysiological studies in addition to outcomes analysis? And Ken, could you just address the issue of whether you considered the safety endpoints in your non-core part?
We have, and those typically were not included in the non-core category. So again, what I want to come back to, though, is that we needed to use a systematic method to tie the protocol procedures to specific objectives and endpoints, and that's why we used the clinical study report and the analysis plan, but then we turned to the clinical teams at the specific sponsor companies to classify procedures, and I think they took a very, very conservative approach. Many who feel that the proportion we're reporting in the study is well below perhaps what could ultimately be categorized as less essential or non-core. Most companies have taken every one of the safety procedures that you've just articulated, and those were considered part of the core of the study.
Thanks.
But this is this is a whole other topic, isn't it? And David Demetz has had a lot of experience in this, but the whole metric-coded strategy of collecting adverse events beyond the first 2,000 patients or so, I think many people believe is of no value at all. We still need to be collecting unexpected serious adverse events, but the amount of energy that goes into generating these vast tables of common things that occur in our lives is many of us believe is an enormous waste of time and resources.
I think that's what exactly what our guidance speaks to. And I think Dave could tell us after the first 2,000 what the probability is that we're going to get more information, except for a very rare event, which we have to wait and have Rich find for us in Sentinel.
Yeah.
Eric?
Yeah, Eric Peterson, Duke. It is a funny statement, though. A lot of one man's non-core variables are another man's treasure. We do have to realize that during the 2 days back-to-back, we've sort of been or conflicting in our own statements. There were statements made yesterday that every randomized trial, these should have a secondary randomization or a design such that you might be able to answer 2 questions with one very large study. We've talked about the degree to which we want to develop a better understanding of personalization of medicine. That only comes in part with richness of data. So, and then we have to negate the idea that you're carrying out a $50 million plus study. The degree to which potentially other science carried along with it may be even more important than answering the primary question on the study is an interesting phenomena that we run into. Now, it's not to say that we should go hog wild on any collection of data, but it is a realization that there is a balance between the data collected and the ultimate value to it, both for answering the primary question as well as the value to the field of science. I mean, if you looked at the women's health study or a lot of other initiatives that have been done, perhaps as much science has come around from the things around it than actually the original question. It was in part driven by people at the front end not collecting data with no purpose, but the idea of very specifically designed data elements that might carry forward, even if they're non-core.
But we still have some undeniable facts, which is that, as Davis pointed out, that the vast majority of fields that are collected are never used for publication. So
that's right. I would pick up on the concept of balance here and just say that historically, when it comes to registration studies, the scientific objectives, the scientific interests of the program have trumped all other objectives. But in the current operating environment where efficiency and more careful resource management comes into play, we really have to balance the operating feasibility of the study. We have to consider the burden that we're placing on the study volunteer and on the investigative site. And as a result, I think we really have to challenge the assumption that every procedure we add to our protocols is necessary. Clearly, our data, our research suggests that there are a lot of things going on here that cannot be tied to the primary objectives or endpoints of the study.
Ralph?
Oh,
okay.
Dan Campion with Quintiles Outcome. The Center for Devices and Radiologic Health put out a report a couple weeks ago calling for a new strategy for device surveillance, safety surveillance. And it calls for development of national registries that would meet not only the periodic needs for post-approval studies, but also ongoing needs for safety surveillance by the agency, potentially clinical quality improvement, et cetera. Just wondering from your experience with trials, et cetera, what do you think the elements of those kind of partnerships could be to have actually ongoing national registries? We see these kind of registries in other countries, but seldom do we see them here and sustainable in the long run.
Thanks very much for introducing that really good comment, Dan. Bram Zuckerman, Center for Devices, so I'll take this one for Rachel. But I think there are several common themes that have permeated this conference and are well recognized at FDA. Number one, the current system isn't the most appropriate one for the 21st century, especially in the arena of post-market surveillance, which is extremely important for device iteration and development with rapid total product life cycle development, et cetera. So what you read in that report is the truth. Doctors Maisel and Sherman are quite interested in developing a national registry structure that it can incorporate appropriate IDE trials that are user-friendly, as well as accumulate aggregate data that can be useful for a field of devices en masse. So I would recommend that you try to follow up with the folks who wrote that document, especially Denitza Marinak, and Rick has worked with her closely. He may want to make a few points in that regard and to pursue that line of endeavor, because it's a good area where some of these concepts can be utilized in a practical format. Rick, did you want to say anything else?
I think you covered. Did you have a question as well?
I'm sorry, what?
Did you have a question as well?
Yeah. I did have a question for you, Rick. Since we're on the subject of devices, number one, thanks for introducing the fact that in the device trial arena, we have exactly the same problems. And, you know, while Rachel did a really nice job of explaining our drug regulations, the same regulations really apply in devices, in that common good fundamental principles of clinical trial design is what underlines the FDA regulatory system. Yet you gave us a great example of where things seem to perhaps to be a little bit askew in the device world. I don't know if you want to give us the particular device, but I suspect it's in my division. So as someone who has a practical day job, who can't do this just for a living, I do want to compliment you just on your organization of this meeting with many other people. What do you do when you go back to Medtronic tomorrow and realize that there's a disconnect? What do you see as some low-hanging fruit that can be corrected?
Well, thanks for asking that question. And we have started that process because, like many of us in this room, we're on unsustainable growth in the cost of clinical trials. So if you take specifically our company, I think we spent $150 million in clinical research in 2005, and we'll probably spend $450 million next year. So the compound annual growth rate is about 25 to 30% per year, and it looks like it's not going to go down. What this means is that it's eating into the R&D budget. So there are now more resources being shifted to clinical trial evaluation of products rather than product development and product design. And that's not a good thing, because the technology, I mean, what we have, at least what medical devices should provide, is advances in technology that help solve patient suffering. And when those advances in engineering and technologies that are exploding and offer the fantastic opportunities for miniaturization, for example, are and lower costs in and of themselves by design aspects on manufacturing, are now shifted to the clinical evaluation part, when it's not necessary. That's not a good thing for anybody. I think the first thing we want to do is to, and what's interesting is, and I think I can speak for probably most of the device companies, we really didn't pay attention to reducing the number of fields of studies. If you look at the way most clinical trials are managed, they're managed by project managers, not really by clinical trialists. So, and we have very good project managers in business. They operate things, they run Gantt charts, and they really operate very, very well. But they aren't in an authority position to challenge a principal investigator on what to do. And that's something that we need to change. And we need to both increase the competency of people who run studies to understand what clinical trial science is about, to ask the questions, which I don't think exists right now in most areas, especially in devices. The second thing is to push back on some of the principal investigators who actually want to come up with fields that are their kind of pet fields and so on. So those are the low-hanging fruit for us, is to say that, you know, do we really want to go after that and start to provide attention to move this back? And I think as the theme we've seen here, we can't continue on the path we're on right now. It's just not possible that we're going to continue to do all the evaluation we need and to satisfy all the massive gaps in evidence if we don't change things going forward. So that to me is the low-hanging fruit, is to go back. And I think maybe there's a momentum or critical mass if we start to get this out more, that more people will be more lean in their choices of what to do and study. And we pay more attention to the waste of fields that aren't being used. the unethical aspects of that as well, which I think is really critical, and those all things hopefully will snowball into a change.
Yeah, as I'm a health services researcher, and so I'm kind of an outsider listening to this discussion of drug development. But what it strikes me is that many of the discussions that we're having this afternoon are in miniature the same discussions we're having about healthcare system reform. And a couple of specific analogies, the notion of balancing useful versus wasteful services. You know, if we do lots of tests on lots of people, maybe we'll find something that can help someone, is sort of the, you know, it's a clinical discussion that we have larger than the clinical trials enterprise. Another analogy that I hear is the issue about the alignment of incentives. Chris, you said something really important, which is that there's lots of interests that are vested in keeping the system exactly the way it is, such as the CROs, because that's what their business models are built on, rather than trying to align incentives so that you know, all the participants involved can benefit from efforts at cost containment and improved efficiency. So I guess my question is, are there ongoing discussions in the clinical trials enterprise about how to align the incentives of the various participants more effectively to help control the costs?
I mean, I think that's, yeah, I think that like today isn't a good example because I think ultimately it has to come down to the patients, their representatives, and the sponsors who are putting the funding into it, and that those forces you know, should be able to be garnered to creating better value in the research energy that we're spending. But it is I mean, I think it's a major factor. Others could comment from their perspectives as well. But certainly, you know, even at the DCR, even an academic research organization, we're dependent on the margins that we make from some of these activities. Certainly, pharmaceutical companies' regulatory departments, they have a vested stake at making themselves important and useful by, you know, by modifying risk. So I think we're all in this, and we all need to be, you know, kind of transforming the way we're thinking about this.
Doug Throckmorton, FDA. First, just let me say Bram's interest in registries is something CDER, Center for Drugs, is also shares. We just recently convened our Drug Safety Board talking about registries and how we could be using them in a broader sense than we are at present, because I would say the drug side has lagged behind the device side in terms of that exploration, honestly. One particularly interesting model that people raised was the VA, and the VA use of a large database and then using it to look at particular subfractions of their population seemed like a pretty interesting model. The second thing I want to say is I agree completely that the current model is not sustainable in terms of a viable future development of drugs. I was struck by the level of the information, the granularity that was presented here about where those costs are coming from. And then I tried to match that granularity up with my experience within the center. So Chris started his who's to blame slide with us. Thanks a lot. Now, Rob Califf is here, so we're routinely blamed for everything, including global warming, and I'm prepared to accept that at some level. But as I looked at that list of expensive parts of the clinical trials enterprise, they were not things that I remembered influencing, even paying much attention to, honestly, when I was doing my primary review work and division director work. They were things that I might have been done with the expectation that I was going to be looking at them or something, but that honestly, they were not things that we were paying a lot of attention to. So I wonder if some of the other drivers were reacting to what they anticipated we would want without really checking, or as Rachel suggested, failing to push back when they heard something from us that felt sort of less than supportable. And that maybe the thing to do is to encourage, as she did, respectful inquiry, to ask us, to support why we're asking for the various pieces that we are.
But if I agree with you, except that if I had a nickel for every time I said to a company, why did you do that? And they said, because we thought that's what you'd want. And then I would say, well, why didn't you ask us? So I think that
We both have lots of nickels.
lots of nickels. And if anyone can remember back to Bert Spilker's clinical trials textbook, which sits on Bob Temple's shelf, his advice to drug companies, and it's in Bob Temple's office, everyone sees, do not talk to the FDA, because you don't know what they're going to tell you. It's better, just to go in late. So that was from about 86. So yes and no. On the other hand, at 3 o'clock, I'm going to get on the phone with a company. So we have, we're trying to revitalize antibacterial drug development. We're going to beg them not to go forward with a 20-page consent form, among other things that we're going to try to squeeze out of them. So, not that we're completely innocent. Sometimes I think, absolutely, Doug, people don't push back when they're given perhaps either not so thoughtful advice or not so expert advice and a more senior person, et cetera. But sometimes it's just too easy to say, well, the regulators want it, when we don't.
Ron Kroll from Pennsylvania. Pulling a microphone down. I'm going to speak out of both sides of my mouth, having spent a lot of time in the last 10 years of my career, both at AstraZeneca and GSK, trying to encourage people to collect fewer data points. But I think some of the conversation this afternoon seems to me at risk of conflating two very different things. One is the early generation of evidence about drugs, and the other is large, simple trials. I just want to comment on a couple of observations around why there may be institutional drive to collect a lot of data in the phase 2B, 3B environment, and remind people that in that environment, you're generally collecting data on the 500 to 2,000, 3,000 persons exposed to your drug. And anybody who's developed drugs for very long has had at least one experience where 20 of those patients were really important. And the fact that you had some data on some visits that you probably wouldn't have thought were really very important to have, or collected some data point that you might have thought you could easily go without. That kind of experience is a very big kind of anchor on giving up data on patients in that environment. And similarly, probably the biggest thing that someone who's responsible for trials in that phase of drug development is worried about is time. And time there is made up of getting those patients into trials and getting those trials completed. So those two things alone in those phases of trials, and I'm not arguing that it's right, I'm certain that there could be less data collected, fewer data points collected, and that it could be done more efficiently, and I drove for that for a long time. But I think that's very different from the problem that we're talking about here, which is trying to find ways to take those questions that can be answered very simply, large numbers of patients, quickly enrolled, small numbers of data points, in order to drive to an answer for a healthcare system.
Just staying there. Go ahead, John.
Well, I also wanted to discuss sort of this tension between keeping things simple and really optimizing what we can learn from a trial, where the recruitment of patients and just the time and the effort, participant burden of just being in a trial is really I think the primary cost. And I think it's so important to make the distinction between, for example, having a prior hypothesis about an outcome, like with an ancillary study that you might piggyback onto a randomized trial. This is following up on what Eric Peterson was saying. We learned so much in the Women's Health Initiative. One of the ancillary studies was cognitive function and dementia, and that was purely an ancillary study to the main trial. It had to be done during the active, randomization phase to learn what the effects on cognitive outcome were. And if there had been a real hesitation to add any ancillary studies and just focus on what were the primary outcomes of the trial, that information never would have been gleaned. In something like yesterday, I was presenting the vitamin D and omega-3 trial, and we have multiple ancillary studies, which actually are minimal time commitment and burden for the participants, but to be able to make use of that trial to all, the primary outcomes are cancer and CVD, but to also learn about cognitive function and diabetes and depression and autoimmune diseases, it's actually a very small incremental cost. But there are prior hypotheses, strong prior hypotheses. Those ancillary studies have withstood peer review and have funding behind them. So I think we really do have to make a distinction. We don't want to just add blindly a lot of data and a lot of endpoints to data collection forms, a lot of additional exposures and outcomes, but in particular, when there is a strong prior hypothesis and you're talking about being able to really enhance the knowledge gained from a randomized trial with relatively small additional burden, I think it's overall a win-win to do that.
Thanks for the comment. I think that's a really important point. And I think that one thing that we didn't discuss, and we may not have time to get into detail, is just the type 1 error issues associated with all of those endpoints. So when we saw that there were 13 secondary endpoints listed on average, I remember that there was a controlled clinical trials journal that was dedicated to the type 1 error issues about secondary endpoints. And there are a variety of different solutions. The whole journal was dedicated to it. What I thought was most interesting was the hierarchical ranking of the list, so that when you at least publish it, you can still use a nominal p-value, but you have to say this was my 13th hypothesis, for example. So that might actually reduce the number of fields too, so that what you're saying, Jen, is that if you're selective and put those things in place, and they make a lot of sense, rather than basically doing a broad stroke to look at everything and hoping later to address one of those 35 secondary endpoints if the data comes out to be positive.
Just a couple of, I guess, responses. First of all, to Dr. Throckmorton, actually, FDA is responsible for a terrible global warming problem. There's a classic British Medical Journal article on the carbon cost of clinical trial monitoring that goes into this in great detail and actually does the calculations from these nurses flying around on airplanes, intimidating investigators like me about using whiteout on case record forms. But it seems like the construct here is I don't think anyone would argue with the point that Ron made that up to somewhere around patient 2000 in drug trials, I would argue in device trials, it's a lot earlier. You pretty much have got to have a very broad scan for things happening that may even be not serious but could be really important in terms of making a decision about whether you even go to the next phase of exploration. But Rick, this is actually a question for you and other industry people. I'll just frame it by saying I hope people recognize that when Chris showed the slides about the cost of pharmaceutical trials in industry, that number was $400 million. And we've just finished a couple of trials that were over $500 million. And if you begin to think about what could be done with that money relative to what it was spent on, it would be societally valuable. You made the point, Rick, even if you applied it back into the companies to study more things or take more shots on goal, given the fact that we know that it's an imprecise science where you can't predict very well what's going to happen, it's a tremendous waste of money that's going on right now. So the question is, if there was a public system, and this is a tough question, I think, if there was a public system, just imagine, that was efficient, that had the trust of the FDA, might even be built on a set of registries in most diseases combined with electronic health records, that once you got beyond that magic point of 2,000 or whatever the right number is, where you really shouldn't collect all the non-serious adverse events anymore, it's a waste of time, most people agree. Would the industry ever trust a public system to take its most valuable assets and do the evaluation before registration, or in this thing we're talking about now with graduated approval in the crease? And I think a lot of what's at stake here is, came up earlier today, which is if you put it on the positive side, you'd say you got to make sure things get done on the timeline. How can you trust someone else to do it? The other side of that coin would be control, and how much of drug development is actually gaming based on the way you design the studies, the comparators you choose, versus what might be done if you had a PCORI method of patients' public input into the design. The way the trials, even the framing of the trials, might be entirely different. Could industry ever get to that point? Because to me, that's where the biggest amount of money is being wasted now, is probably in the drug trials that are in this $500 million range.
Well, I'll try to answer that in a couple short minutes, and I can't speak for the drug side. What I can say is I think that you're going to see trends for industry not viewing clinical research as a competitive tool. That our competitive tools are actually the development of technology and drugs and devices. The other thing is that there's potentially an incentive using your economy of scale to run these big studies to keep other competitors out. And that does favor large companies, to be sure, and allows someone to not even worry about the $500 million because they have a multi-billion-dollar blockbuster that they're going to sell for the next 20 years. And so that's a drop in the bucket of cost if you look at the ROI for that, going forward. That's probably why they spend $500 million for a potential blockbuster. My biggest concern that I see regularly is we're shifting to a more transparent environment. That horse has left the barn. We likely will be sharing our data, and you're going to see more and more drug companies, device companies sharing data. We're starting to do other companies are. And I think that my concern is still about methods. That is that when we are going to evaluate a product, and this is true in the surveillance aspect as well, it's such a new science. For example, surveillance, signal detection, issue escalation, actions to take, policies, and so on, that if you give that up to somebody else and it affects how operations work in your company, it's actually, potentially you could get sued by your shareholders for that. And I think it's a real issue to be concerned. So once I think we develop a solid and trustworthy methodology, I don't think there will be that much of a concern about who's doing the work. And that may be one of the main reasons that industry is holding on to it, is because we do have a lot of resources and we want to drive it. The perverse aspect of that is that you actually control the methods so nobody else can look at them. Then you have kind of your own one-off approach. That also isn't going to work. But I think there's a true honest feeling that businesses feel like they can conduct things and execute very, very well. And they don't feel that's the same in academia. And that's something that was very apparent to me when I shifted over into industry. And I think that as long as it's a critical component in the process of getting a product approved, it's going to be a while before we feel comfortable that that process can be run efficiently with high levels of methodology by an outside group. Once that happens, I don't think it'll be a competitive tool to worry about.
Rick, it's probably time for my transitional question, which I didn't want to ask earlier because it is transitional. It focuses a little bit on the future and the issue of the payment incentives. In the various discussions on policy needs, one of the issues that we didn't deal with was payment structures, funding structures that can make a difference in the way that the clinical trial enterprise plays out. There have been, in the course of the conversations, three very clear items that have been repeated several times. One is the fact that the cost of trials is totally unsustainable. The second is the fact that at least a large number, if not the vast majority, if I understood Deborah correctly, of the trials that are done are really not worth very much in terms of the value they add. And the last item is that we all want to move, and we have the potential to move toward a continuous learning notion. Well, the sort of comment that John Steiner made in his last remark on the healthcare system as a whole, I think is a relevant question, a sort of a wild card to throw in, not to hijack the discussion, but for folks to think about as they move into the next session. And that is, in the general healthcare financing system for payment of medical services, we have obviously become aware of the fact that the fee-for-service system doesn't really work. And we need to move from fee-for-volume to fee-for-value. And that's we've moved fairly quickly to that universal notion. The question is how we get to it. And in fact, there are a number of very interesting experiments underway about how we get to paying for value in healthcare delivery. It is a similar question here. How do we move from fee-for-service to fee-for-value? Are there ways in which the NIH can structure in its investment system not to pay for individual trials, but to pay for the productivity of various units that are actually yielding insights about what works and what doesn't work? So the question for folks to think about is what ways might work in changing the reward system that could get us to where we want to be.
Thanks, Mike. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and go to the break. So let's do a 15-minute break and be back by a hard stop at 10 of 3, and we'll start the next session.